NVIDIA just blinked. After years of dominating the GPU market with an iron grip so tight that AMD could barely breathe, NVIDIA has done the one thing nobody thought was possible. It handed AMD a free pass to the top of the graphics card market, and it did not do it because AMD outsmarted them or out-engineered them or out-marketed them. NVIDIA did it because it got so obsessed with selling artificial intelligence hardware to billion-dollar corporations that it forgot about the gamers, the builders, the creators, and the everyday people who built NVIDIA's empire in the first place. The RTX 6000 series is delayed. It is not coming when people expected it. It is not arriving to crush AMD's new lineup before AMD gets comfortable at the top. And AMD's RX 1000 series is sitting exactly where AMD has dreamed of sitting for the better part of a decade, at the top of the performance stack, with no competition from a newer NVIDIA product, and with every gamer on Earth suddenly asking the same question at the same time. Does AMD finally win? That question deserves a real answer, and this article is going to give you one without hiding a single thing. To truly feel the weight of what is happening right now, you need to go back and understand what the GPU market has looked like for the past several years. Because the story of AMD versus NVIDIA is not just a story about chips and benchmarks. It is a story about power, about market control, about how one company managed to make an entire industry believe that there was no other serious option. NVIDIA built its dominance through a combination of genuine engineering excellence and ruthless narrative control. The RTX 2000 series introduced real-time ray tracing and made it a benchmark category that NVIDIA defined and AMD had no answer for. The RTX 3000 series delivered generational performance leaps that made AMD's contemporary lineup look like a generation behind even when the raw rasterization numbers told a more complicated story. The RTX 4000 series arrived with DLSS 3 and frame generation technology that created an entirely new performance tier that AMD's existing upscaling solution could not match. Every single generation, NVIDIA set the terms of the conversation, defined which performance metrics mattered, and left AMD scrambling to respond to a battlefield that was always arranged on NVIDIA's terms. AMD was not helpless during this period. The RDNA architecture was a genuine engineering achievement. The RX 6000 series delivered competitive rasterization performance that forced NVIDIA to respond with price adjustments it would not have made. Otherwise, the RX 7000 series continued that progress and gave AMD genuine victories in specific performance brackets and specific workloads. But AMD could never escape the gravitational pull of whatever NVIDIA had coming next. Every time AMD launched a product and started gaining momentum, NVIDIA would either cut prices on existing hardware to undercut AMD's value proposition, or begin marketing the next generation loudly enough that a significant portion of the market would simply wait for green team hardware rather than committing to red. AMD was perpetually fighting a battle on two fronts, against NVIDIA's existing products and against NVIDIA's future products, and winning decisively on neither front because the two-front nature of the competition always diluted whatever advantage AMD managed to build. The RTX 6000 delay collapses that two-front battle into a single front for the first time in years. There is no NVIDIA next generation to wait for right now in any practical sense. There is no imminent green team launch that gives undecided consumers a reason to hold off on an AMD purchase. There is just AMD's RX 1000 series sitting at the top of the market, reviewed, available, shipping, and performing at levels that have genuinely surprised people who had already made up their minds that AMD could not compete at the highest tier. That change of the competitive environment is more profound than any individual benchmark number, because it changes the entire psychology of the GPU buying decision for millions of consumers who are making that decision right now during the delay window. The reasons behind the RTX 6000 delay tell an important story about where NVIDIA's real priorities have moved and why consumers should understand those priorities clearly. NVIDIA's transformation into an artificial intelligence infrastructure company has been one of the most dramatic corporate pivots in the history of the technology industry. The H100 GPU, designed for training and running large AI models in data centers, generates more revenue per unit than hundreds of consumer gaming GPUs combined. The demand for NVIDIA's data center AI hardware from cloud providers, technology companies, governments, and research institutions has been so overwhelming that NVIDIA's manufacturing partner TSMC has been running at absolute capacity trying to meet it. Within that capacity-constrained environment, NVIDIA has been forced to make allocation decisions about which products get priority access to the most advanced manufacturing processes, and those decisions have consistently prioritized data center products over consumer products, because the financial logic is impossible to argue with. The specific technical challenge that has compounded the allocation problem is that NVIDIA's next-generation GPU architecture has encountered yield difficulties at TSMC's most advanced production nodes. Yield in semiconductor manufacturing refers to the percentage of chips produced on a wafer that function correctly and meet performance specifications. When yields are low, a manufacturer either accepts higher costs per working chip, which forces retail prices up to levels that destroy consumer demand, or it delays the launch until process improvements bring yields to acceptable levels. NVIDIA, having watched what happened to its reputation during the RTX 3000 series launch, when supply constraints created a retail disaster that took over a year to fully resolve, has made the pragmatic decision to delay rather than launch a product it cannot support with adequate supply. That decision is arguably the right one for the long-term health of the product line. But it is an enormous short-term gift to AMD that AMD did not have to earn through its own efforts. AMD's RX 1000 series deserves to be evaluated on its own merits independently of the competitive gift the delay represents, because the hardware itself tells an important story about where AMD's GPU engineering program has arrived after years of continuous architectural development. The ray tracing performance improvement in the RX 1000 generation is the most significant single advancement in the lineups, and the one that has generated the most genuine surprise among reviewers and enthusiasts who went into their testing with expectations shaped by AMD's historical weakness in that specific workload. Previous AMD GPU generations were so far behind NVIDIA in ray tracing performance that the gap was essentially a closed conversation. Reviewers would note the gap. AMD fans would argue about whether ray tracing mattered in practice, and NVIDIA would use the gap as a talking point in every marketing communication. The RX 1000 series does not close the gap entirely, but it reduces it to the point where the conversation is genuinely open again, where AMD hardware delivers a ray tracing experience that is meaningfully better than previous AMD generations, and competitive enough with NVIDIA's current available lineup that the gap is no longer a decisive factor in most real gaming scenarios. The FSR4 upscaling technology that ships with the RX 1000 series represents an equally important advancement in a different dimension of the competitive equation. NVIDIA's DLSS technology has been one of the company's most powerful competitive moats for several years, not because most gamers can reliably tell the difference between DLSS output and native rendering in fast-moving game scenarios, but because the perception of DLSS as a premium feature created a narrative framework where AMD hardware was always described as lacking something important, even when its rasterization performance was directly competitive. FSR4 closes that perception gap in a way that previous FSR versions did not. The image quality output is close enough to DLSS 3 quality that the narrative of AMD as the upscaling underdog is genuinely harder to sustain. And in a market where consumer perception drives purchase decisions as much as objective performance data does, changing that narrative has real commercial value that shows up in sales numbers over time. The power efficiency story of the RX 1000 series is the improvement that gets the least dramatic coverage in enthusiast media, but that has the most practical impact on the widest range of actual purchasing decisions. The RX 7000 series earned a reputation, partly deserved and partly exaggerated by NVIDIA marketing, for being power-hungry and thermally demanding in ways that made system builders cautious about recommending AMD hardware to clients working with budget power supplies, or small form factor cases. Whether that reputation was entirely fair to the actual hardware is a debate for another article. What matters competitively is that the reputation existed and that it was costing AMD sales. The RX 1000 series delivers substantially better performance per watt than any previous AMD GPU generation, with flagship tier performance available at power consumption, levels that make the hardware genuinely comfortable for a much wider range of system configurations than previous AMD flagships could accommodate. Builders who were steering customers toward NVIDIA hardware for thermal and power management reasons now have a concrete reason to reconsider, and when the builder community's recommendation patterns shift, retail sales follow. The gaming community's response to the RX 1000 series in the absence of an RTX 6000 counter-narrative has been qualitatively different from the response to previous AMD GPU launches in ways that are difficult to quantify precisely, but easy to observe in any major gaming or PC building community online. Normally, when AMD launches a significant GPU generation, the conversation splits almost immediately between people genuinely evaluating the AMD hardware and people who have already decided to wait for whatever NVIDIA is going to announce next. That split is AMD's structural disadvantage in the narrative war, because half the potential audience for every positive AMD review is already shopping elsewhere mentally. Without a credible near-term RTX 6000 launch date to anchor the waiting narrative, the RX 1000 conversation is more focused and more sustained than AMD GPU conversations have been in years. People are actually deciding to buy rather than deciding to wait, and that shift from evaluation mode to purchase mode is where AMD's market share gains actually materialize. Content creators and streamers who are building or upgrading systems right now are doing something with AMD hardware that they have not done in a long time. They are choosing it as the primary option rather than as the alternative to something from NVIDIA they would prefer to have. The practical significance of this shift is hard to overstate because of how powerfully creator adoption influences the broader consumer market. When a gaming creator with a large audience builds a system on camera and that system has an AMD GPU in it, every viewer of that content absorbs a message about what serious creators use. When streamers are running RX 1000 hardware and delivering content at quality levels that their audiences find impressive, the implicit product endorsement that results is more valuable than any advertising campaign. AMD has been largely shut out of this organic creator endorsement cycle for years because NVIDIA hardware was almost always the better or newer option. At the moment, creators were making upgrade decisions. The RTX 6000 delay has temporarily but meaningfully reversed that dynamic, and AMD needs to maximize the value of every day that dynamic holds. The retail and distribution dimension of AMD's current competitive position is less exciting to discuss than benchmarks or community narratives, but it determines in very practical terms how many units actually sell and how much long-term market share AMD can capture from this window. Retailers and e-commerce platforms allocate promotional positioning, featured product placements, and advertising co-op budgets based on what they expect to generate the best return. And right now, AMD's RX 1000 series is generating the kind of consumer interest and sell-through velocity that earns those promotional investments. AMD needs to be working aggressively with its retail partners to convert favorable market conditions into deep shelf presence, strong promotional support, and the kind of sustained visibility that keeps the hardware in front of consumers who are actively researching GPU purchases throughout the entire delay window, rather than just in the first few weeks after launch. NVIDIA is not standing still while AMD enjoys its moment in the sun, and anyone who thinks the green team is passively watching AMD take market share without responding is misreading the situation. NVIDIA's most powerful tool for managing its competitive position without shipping new consumer hardware is pricing on its existing RTX 4000 series, and there is already clear evidence that NVIDIA and its board partners are deploying that tool strategically. RTX 4070 and 4080 prices have been adjusted downward in ways that are calibrated to maintain competitive pressure on AMD's mid-range and upper mid-range RX 1000 positioning without being dramatic enough to generate the kind of media coverage that would acknowledge AMD's competitive success. NVIDIA can continue making these adjustments throughout the delay window, accepting margin compression on older inventory as the cost of preventing AMD from dominating the mainstream buying decision on value grounds. This response does not stop AMD from winning, but it narrows the margin of victory in the market segments where most consumers actually buy. The creative professional segment is where AMD's opportunity is most complicated and where the RTX 6000 delay alone is not sufficient to shift established purchasing patterns in AMD's favor. NVIDIA's dominance in professional creative workflows is built on the Q-Day programming ecosystem that underlies the most widely used creative software tools, on Adobe's deep hardware optimization for NVIDIA GPUs across its entire Creative Cloud suite, on the AI-powered features and tools like Premiere Pro, After Effects, and Lightroom that leverage NVIDIA's tensor cores in ways that AMD's architecture does not yet match through equivalent software support. A video editor who has built a professional workflow around NVIDIA-specific features and who has client deadlines and business revenue dependent on that workflow running reliably is not going to switch to AMD hardware during the RTX 6000. Delay window because AMD is now the newest option available. The switching cost is measured in potential workflow disruption, in plug-in incompatibility, in the time cost of troubleshooting new driver issues in the middle of active production work. AMD can and should target newer creators who have not yet locked into NVIDIA-specific workflows, students and emerging professionals making their first serious hardware investment, and creators whose workloads are primarily rasterization-heavy rather than CUDA-dependent. These are genuine opportunities with real commercial value, but they do not represent a comprehensive takeover of the professional creative market within a single competitive window. The long-term question that the RTX 6000 delay and the RX 1000 opportunity ultimately raises is the most important one, and it is the question that separates a genuinely significant shift in the GPU market from a temporary favorable condition that AMD enjoys briefly and then loses when NVIDIA inevitably resets the competitive landscape. Can AMD use this window to build ecosystem momentum, brand trust, community loyalty, and market share that compounds and persists beyond the window itself? Can AMD establish enough of a foothold in gamer, creator, and builder communities that when the RTX 6000 eventually arrives, and NVIDIA's full marketing machine comes back online, AMD is defending meaningful market share rather than starting from near zero again? Can AMD invest the revenue from stronger than usual GPU sales into the software ecosystem? Development, developer relationship building, and driver quality improvement that would make future AMD GPU generations genuinely harder to dismiss, even when NVIDIA is competing at full strength? The history of AMD in the GPU market does not provide entirely encouraging answers to these questions. AMD has had competitive windows before and has not always made the most of them. The RX 6000 series was genuinely competitive on rasterization. Performance metrics and AMD still ended that generation with a minority share of the discrete GPU market. The pattern of AMD making good hardware that does not translate into lasting market share gains is real, and it is a function of execution gaps in software, ecosystem, and marketing that hardware quality alone cannot bridge. But the RTX 6000 delay is a more significant and more sustained competitive opening than anything AMD has had in recent memory. And the RX 1000 hardware is a more comprehensively improved product than any previous AMD GPU generation in terms of addressing the specific weaknesses that drove the most purchase decisions toward NVIDIA. The combination of a better product and a more favorable competitive window creates conditions for AMD success that are genuinely without recent precedent. The final answer to whether the RTX 6000 delay equals an AMD RX 1000 win is that the delay makes an AMD win possible in a way that nothing AMD did on its own could have made possible. The hardware is good enough to win. The market conditions are favorable enough to win. The community sentiment is open enough to win. What remains to be seen is whether AMD's execution across pricing, supply, software, retail, and community engagement is disciplined and sustained enough to convert possible into actual. If AMD executes, this is the turning point. If AMD hesitates, this is the opportunity that people will spend the next decade discussing as the moment AMD had everything it needed and still could not close the deal. The GPU war is not over. It is not even close to over. But for the first time in years, AMD is holding the better hand, and everyone who follows this market is watching to see what AMD does with it.